Gaudete, gaudete, Christus es natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
Hello, good evening, everybody. We would like to welcome you to our channel here. I am Great Pharaoh, and this is Ivor Kovac, and you are watching Rediscovery, or rather listening to us. We are excited to go about a topic that we have been going on for some time. As far as the last talk we had had a saint story with Saint Rita, and before that was Saint Veronica. So we're sort of on this boat, if you will, of talking about saint stories. So today we're going to be talking about Saint Francis of Assisi. The reason why I picked this saint is because, once again, this is a saint that is well known amongst all Christian denominations for the most part, all the way from, you have the Orthodox churches, the Catholic churches, to all the Protestant churches. A lot of Christians have probably heard of him, and most Catholics as well. For Christians who haven't heard of him, especially Catholics, they would at least probably have heard the term the Franciscan monastic order. And
yeah,
so
I've heard of that. I was going to ask you if he was connected with that. I think so, right?
Yep.
Can you? I'm sorry. Can you just say like when he lived, what his time span was?
Oh yeah. So he actually lived in the late 12th century, early 12th century, or no, sorry, late 12th century, early 13th century.
Hmm.
Yeah. Late 12th, early 13th, and he passed away at a generally young age, but we'll get into that. So most Christians probably, or at least most Catholics, have heard the Franciscan order, which he started, which was basically, there's 3 or 4 main monastic orders in Catholicism. You have like the Franciscan order, which is more focused towards, serving the poor people, which is what St. Francis of Assisi did. And you have the Dominican order, which is more focused on preaching to the masses. And you have the Benedictine monastic order, which is more of the communal monastic life rather than going and serving out. It's more about praying and fasting in a community and praying for the world. And then you have the Augustinian order, which is sort of that really far, the far right, where it's sort of like a hermitage type of community where they're not all even together. They're not just outside of society, but they're really kind of spread out and they're kind of living as hermits. So he did start the Franciscan order, and basically, long ago, in the late 12th century, early 13th century, a young man by the name of Francis Bernardo, I believe that's his last name. Forgive me if I mispronounce it, but he was he was a son of a very wealthy merchant. He was pretty much like a young prince, and he had everything going for him. But later he would turn his back on the world, and the world would make him a saint. But becoming a saint would be the very last thing that he ever wanted, and we'll get into that later. This is what makes him.
I got a question. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Maybe our viewers would also want to know, like, okay, so you said there were 4 different monastic orders in Catholicism. Is that right?
Correct.
So
yes.
The monastic, do these orders also, is it also women, like the nuns? Are these orders like for men and women, or is it just men?
It's mainly just men. As far as the women goes, you will hear like thank you for that question. Actually, it is for women as well, because I'm familiar with the Dominican sisters of the Eucharist, and they're in Detroit. So Dominican does cover the nunnery side, and then I have heard of the Carmelite nuns. They're also very well known too. So probably that passes on to the nuns as well. Um, and I'm trying to get his last name. Uh, I think it was Saint Francis Bernardo, but I can't. Let me see how you pronounce that. Yeah, Barnardorn. Uh, Barna Barnard Barnardorn. Yeah, Barnardorn. And he basically, like I said, he was a son of a very wealthy um, cloth merchant. So his whole life, like I said, he never expected to become a saint. Really, he was just dedicated to the gospel of Christ. And as you'll find later in his life, he did a lot more than just sharing the gospel. He did really walk as Christ from a young age, and would actually change the course of the Catholic Church forever. When he started the Franciscan order, and he preserved a lot of original um, teachings from the gospel, and protected the Catholic Church from further corruption or dilution of the gospel. So, during this time, it's 13th century Italy, right? We're in the Dark Age, okay? And there's just fires of war, okay? During this time, emperors are fighting against popes. uh, cities are fighting against cities. Nobles are fighting against merchants. There's a lot of short life. There's lots of disease, and death is just lurking everywhere. And in this small town of Assisi, Italy, in 1202, you have this young man who sort of, along with his entire town, is sort of oblivious to all this crazy stuff going on in their area. And he's just basically a happy-go-lucky fellow. I wouldn't say happy-go-lucky as much as rambunctious. He was a very rambunctious fellow. And just imagine a scene of him celebrating his 20th birthday, and he was very roused about, and he really was a vivid, colorful, type of personality. He was very joyous, and he loved to sing. He loved to say jokes, and he really loved to have a good time. He was sort of a playboy, if you will, and in his teenage years, he was a leader. And they would go, and him and his friends, they'd play in the streets, and they'd go to parties, and they were anything but pure, but puritanical. And but he was a leader, and he was always the one out for fun, and they even called him King of the Rebels. And he would arouse through like I said, he would arouse through the streets with his friends. So his parents were wealthy, pretty wealthy. I mean, his mother, I think, was part of a noble family. She was born to a wealthy noble family in Assisi. His father was a wealthy cloth merchant, and they both, were wishing great things for their son. They definitely had great expectations for him, that he would carry out the family business, that he would, become a cloth merchant and make a lot of money. And, this would guarantee a luxurious life. He was a luxurious cloth merchant. So when you see those big puffy, you know, um, outfits or suits that they would wear back in the day, that those were sort of the clothing that he was selling. So during this time, money was not as much as a means as it was to an end. It was having money, which created connections and created your social status. It wasn't about the sort of the grind or becoming successful, or in the process of, it's like either you had or you didn't, and that's what made you who you were in society, and where your status was, so to speak. So so at this time, his father was extremely powerful, and we would call him today as a self-made man. There's an Italian term which says "nuovo ricche," like newly rich, something like that. And his name was Pietro Bernardoni. So yeah, so Francis Bernardoni, and basically his father had a great desire, as most merchants did in that period, to have more and more um, wealth. He wanted to create more and more wealth, and he had great plans for his life, but and his family. But those plans were cut short um, due to the wars that were going on in society. So in 1202, so early 13th century, the Civil War breaks out, okay, with the neighboring town of Perugia. And Perugia, you know, you have the most wealthiest men, you know, they're eager to defend their city, right? So Francis was one of those guys who went out and battled against the Perugians. And these guys were just ferocious, and they were attacking the Assisians, and you know, the Perugian army, if you will, they slaughtered them, and they ended up losing that battle. And Francis was one of the first people who took up arms, like I said, but he was also one of the first captured. So he was captured in a dungeon in Perugia, and he was held ransom in a into the darkness of a dam infested sort of dungeon. And he actually got sick, and he caught a severe case of malaria, and he became very ill. And during this time in the dungeon, this would be one of the first turning points of St. Francis of Assisi's life. This would be one of the things that sort of changes perspective on life. So he's there for almost a year, and it becomes almost like a sobering effect. He starts to see all the joys of his life as becoming very vain, and he starts thinking about his eternal life. You know, he's basically saying, wow, you know, I'm in dungeon. My life can just go from this to that so quickly. So, you know, what are the most important things in life, right? So he's sitting in this dungeon, and basically he would start reflecting on his life, and he felt a lot of emptiness, like I said, in the world. So um, finally, what happened? His ransom got paid to be freed from the prison, and when he got out, he realized that he had done everything in life that was that that he considered to be worthless at this point. So he was a playboy. He tried the family business. You know, he tried being glorious in battle in the war, and that was vanity to him. Um, the book of Ecclesiastes always talks about, vanity of all vanities, and things like that. So, that's what he was beginning to see. So everything was a disappointment to him, and he basically wanted to do something with his life. He was been very sick, and he had lost a whole year, and he realized that he was primed to do something heroic at that point. So when he put all the temporal things behind him, and he saw kind of eternity before him, he felt he was called to do something. He had no idea what that was. He didn't have the slightest clue. But he was going to figure that out. And, so in order for him to gain back focus in his life, he kind of would go out and sort of reflect and try to visit, small churches or small chapels, what have you. And when he was actually out there, he actually got mobbed by two robbers. They took like some of his like personal belongings and things like that, and they beat him up, and they kind of threw him to the side of the road, and that even made him even more feel even more bitter towards the world. And he was almost at a breaking point, and in trying to figure out what he was meant to do for his life, but he did have to do something. So he was, God was putting these trials so that he would be able to be, so that he would be prepared to receive, God's will in his life. So he happened to duck in one day into a cool, small half-ruined church called San Damiano, and he happened to gaze up at a crucifix, and it seemed to have said to him, don't you see that, my house is being destroyed? Go and rebuild it for me. And I'm not sure whether went to go visit the crucifix, because there's another source that said he had it as it was a dream that he had. But that's what had happened. It was something very very real to him. It was, it was a clear voice from the Lord. So, Francis, is saying to himself, okay, let me start here by cleaning this, half ruined church here. And, he starts to clean, and he takes it as a literal sense. Little did he know that God meant sort of a really big picture sort of thing, that he would do a lot of wonders for the church, for the Catholic Church, and bringing people back to God and preserving the gospel. So he was just began to repair churches, and he would go from here to there, and he would be in prayer, and he would ask God to enlighten his heart, and he would tell him to get rid of the darkness in his heart and give him true faith, and help him to carry out his holy and true commandments. And so when he leaves that chapel and goes through that initial experience, he becomes a changed man. It's almost like he's risen from the dead, so to speak, began to experience some form of a resurrection. And he realizes that he has to do something really big for his life. So it was a big turning point. And he just started going to lonely caves, and he would go to rundown churches, praying and trying to hear the voice of God more in his life, and trying to get closer to God. So his family and his neighbors, in the times when he was go off by himself and then come back in town and be with the family and society, they began to see a strong change in his spirit, and that he was going through something that was, they couldn't quite get a grasp of. They wasn't quite sure, but they saw that he was changing for, to do something particularly, that he was being, he was being convicted or compelled to do something. So in order to properly begin fixing the churches, he needed to get money. So he actually stole a lot of these luxurious cloth from his father's shop, and he sold it and got some money to go buy some supplies. And he began to, repair the church. And so his father found out about it, and he wasn't too thrilled, to say the least. And because he had been trying for several weeks and several months to get him to, follow the norms of society, take part in the family business, to get married. And at that point, his father reached a breaking point, and he said, I've been patient and loving, but this time you've gone way too far. So he ends up going to a town meeting where he sees the bishop, and he summons some of his friends to go to the piazza and to complain to the bishop that his son cannot use stolen money to go rebuild the church, that this is unacceptable, and that he be, chastened for this and whatnot, and that he come back and take part in the family business, etc. So the whole town was gathering at the time. These little towns in Italy, in these early centuries, everybody kind of knew a little bit about everyone else. That's just how it was back in the day. So Francis arrives, dressed very beautifully in one of his father's, fine clothing, attires, and he takes a stage center. So he gets through the crowd, he goes up to the piazza steps, goes into the main entrance, and he basically prays to God. He puts his arms up. He says, Lord, I'm going to return to you. You are my father from the beginning, and you will always be my father. And I renounce calling my father Pietro Bernardino. You are my true Lord, and I serve you. And with that, he did a very radical thing. He took off all of his father's clothes that he had on, and he tossed it out out of the main entrance of the piazza, and he's bare naked in front of everybody. And immediately the bishop takes his cloth and immediately covers his body, but realized at that point that this young man is becoming a child of the church, and that he's being called to do something great, and they need to begin to support him, that he's on to something, so to speak. But his father is very disturbed at what he has done, and he's very ashamed, he's very embarrassed that his son just basically rejected him and the family home, and in front of the piazza, in front of all the people. And so, you think, how can a saint do something like this? How can a saint take off all his clothes in front of all these people and whatnot? But the gesture was actually very meaningful, because it was basically saying, I'm no longer going to be defined or bound by, the heir apparent of this grand commercial, legacy, or position I'm supposed to fill. I am nakedly following the naked Christ, so to speak. He's imagining, Christ on the cross. So the bishop embraces him, to cover his body, and they realize he's become a child of the church, and we have to protect this young guy. And he seems a bit crazy, but like I said, everybody sort of felt that this was an unordinary person, that he was going to become a saint. A lot of times when people are sort of at this point where they're drawing near to God and they feel they're called to do something, you can go in either direction. You can sort of go crazy, or you really go in that you really begin to lead people to salvation. Now, but the saints in general, as we've seen from our other stories in their lives, did go through embarrassing moments in their life. A lot of people did say that they were crazy. A lot of people did, consider them as mad people, because that's what they called them when they left the piazza. All the people are saying, "Pazzo, pazzo, madman, madman." So, I think he was at that time, I guess, when he was treading on enlightenment and realizing he'd go in either direction. He's hearing all these voices. I'm sure he wondered if he himself was a little bit crazy, but he embraced that role. He embraced that title. One story says that he proclaimed that he's the new crazy man in the world. Novelist Paul Susan, and that he was now going to be serving Christ. He's renounced his earthly father. He's given a peasant's garb, and so he leaves Assisi and goes off and sort of begins this journey. He's not still quite sure what he's going to do, but he's put all his trust in the Lord, and he's left the city. So in the spring of 1206, he sets out on the journey, and this would determine basically the whole course of his life. He would begin to be a wanderer, seeker, and then ultimately a saint. So he goes through this shift, this change, right? And gradual conversion, in general, is the work for all of us as human beings, but it certainly was for him. It was a very gradual process. So as he was going on his journey, he got on a horse, and as he was riding, he passed through a valley. He went through the hills and valleys, and then he would find in that area, he sees something very horrifying to him, which was a leper. He saw a few lepers, and they were considered to be the outcasts of society back in the day.
Yeah, actually, I was going to say something earlier when you were talking about how he went to prison. Back then, going to prison could cause you to end up with leprosy too. Like those prisons were nasty. It was like you're in this cell. There might be water in it with you, and of course there's rats. And if you need to do your business, well, there's a bucket for number 1 and number 2, if you're lucky. Maybe in some cases there's not even a bucket. It might be more like a stable with some straw, and you got to sleep on that straw, and you got to go to the bathroom in like the corner of the cell or something. It's no joke. The medieval period.
Yeah, I mean the lepers. It was automatically considered as something that would happen for people who were living a life of, sin. And,
Right.
that was something that people they were scared of it. They had no idea, where it came from. They were worried that it would be, contagious. And
Yeah, and it is a horrifying disease. Like your body, parts of your body fall off, and you kind of look like a zombie when you get infected with it. Like you can look up, it's horrible. Today there's a cure for it, of course, but back then, the cure was to just not get it in the first place.
yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah,
But I
and
mean,
that's
these
pretty much it.
people, that's how they handled it back then. They would put them in what we call like a leprosarium, and it was just like a small little community, and they're confined sort of below, the city. And when they would get close within 2 miles, they would have to, he would have to like put his cover his nose because the stench, how bad and the smell was of the leper. So
Ah,
it was a very fearful disease. And the that, and actually, so back in the day, so when he was used to just passing them and not even getting near them, but beginning this journey, this is where it would start. And he decides to get off his horse and start approaching them. And I'll tell you what, if he hadn't done this, he probably wouldn't be considered a saint. I mean, this is really, and this just goes to show you the grace of God, because most of us would not even consider do something like this. It's almost like these saints have to do something just really out of the ordinary. There's something, and he goes and approaches this community, and he sees like there's like a clacker. They have somebody who uses like a little clacker, which warns people to stay away from risk of contracting this dreadful disease. So he passes them, and and so the leprosy, it also, it sort of rots it's basically skin that's rotting, like their nose, their face is basically rotting inside of their body.
yeah,
And it's
like a
not a
zombie, almost like a zombie kind of infection.
yeah, it was like a mark of sin, so to speak. And many people, they were asked, um they were, people would go and pray for them. uh, I don't know if they would go to the community, but they would certainly pray to them. But that's how they handled. They would just be in these separate little communities. So he went out, and he began to comfort them, and sort of make them feel this warm compassion, because they don't know what it's like to have somebody to touch them, and or to hug them, or to to be around them. And he just spent some time with them, and basically he was showing them mercy, and being loving and caring. And they're not used to that, right? They're used to people just sort of running away, not coming near them, no one to touch them or anything. And by doing that, he was really showing this grace, this capacity of the divine, to act and do these amazing things. So he was in the leprosarium, constantly nursing the lepers. He was washing, he was washing them, and he was washing the pus. He was washing the pus out of their wounds. And this would be a test, to see, for him, his first test, to be able to look at the lepers' houses, and you know and to actually serve them and stuff. So that's what he did. And he did find their beauty, and he did help find their souls. And so what used to seem bitter to him became very sweet, and it created like a sweetness in his soul and his body. And and like I said, without that radical shift, nobody would have probably ever heard of him, because that was sort of the first act of mercy, compassion, and serving the poor. So overall, he still continued a lot of his core traits. He was always been happy and joyful. So he was very content with everything that he had, and he began to be known around the town as the guy who would, provide you with food and drink, and take his shirt off his back if you needed something or you needed some clothing. And so he began to be known in the town to be like this philanthropic, or this, amazing, just this angelic type of presence, so to speak. So he would sing constantly. He would always be in joy, praising God. And basically his whole goal was basically show the love of God. He wanted to be like a fool for Christ. And like I said, that's constantly the theme we see with these saints, is they essentially become fools for Christ. And they're sort of, they're out of society, but they try to bring the love of God in their own unique way to the world, without being what's the word, hysterical or something, or having hysteria, or
Dramatic.
thinking.
I think you're without being dramatic.
Yeah, I mean,
Dramatic.
without trying to feel like, you're above everybody, sort of, so to speak. Um,
That
it's like the word
stupid.
hysteria, I think. Uh,
Hysteria means you're out of control. You're hysteria means you're like out of control, kind of panicking or getting caught up in something. I think elitist is the word you're looking for. Where
maybe, or
elitism is where you think you're
narcissistic,
better.
or something.
Yeah.
He just wanted to make the place better in his own simple way, without being, too grandiose. I think that's the word, grandiose. Just to serve, change the world quietly, or not, um, and so he would begin by following the teachings of Jesus. And he was ministering to the society's outcasts. And he also would beg for his daily bread. So he embraced poverty. Um, and when people saw that he was embracing poverty and serving the poor, this began to attract a lot of followers. And just like Christ, when the disciples started to follow him, people were starting to follow him as well. So they saw something authentic about him. And he didn't intend to attract any followers. It was his model to be, sort of on his own, and just to be monastic, if you will, just be on his own, and living solely for Christ. And they wanted to live with him. They wanted to understand his way of life, and they wanted to receive his blessing, and to continue learning from him. So um, they also would follow him, and they also gave what they had to the poor, and they were content with their one tunics, patched, and they desired nothing, and nothing more than what Saint Francis was desiring, and they enjoyed it, and this became a brotherhood that was forming. And these are just ordinary guys, um, but they are from different levels of society. So he was able, So Francis, the Bible says, if the people don't have a vision, the people suffer. For lack, my people suffer for a lack of knowledge. When the people do not have a vision, they suffer this and that. So God was giving him visions continuously of what he wanted to do, or how he saw the salvation of the church, and what he wanted Saint Francis to do. So he was constantly being guided. God was showing him things in dreams like that. So he was able to sort of shape how this brotherhood would go out and serve people. And the main thing was following the gospel. This was something that appealed to a lot of people, because this is at the time when people are troubled by a lot of violence. There's a lot of great violence in Italy's countryside, in the towns. They were very suspicious about this new commercial society, and they were very disturbed and distraught by the increasing institutionalization of the church, right, and the wealth of the church. So this basically stood in contrast with what Francis's message was to actually go out and serve the poor, not acquire things, but actually to go out to them directly, helping them, serving them, preaching to them. And people at this point, like I said, they're very unhappy with the church. There was much scandal. There was a great scandal at the time, especially amongst the priests, and clergy, breaking their vows of chastity, scandalous tales of priests, doing a number of despicable things. They were avaricious, lazy, and could not be relied on. So, St. Francis, when he begins to work within the church and outside of the church, he begins to put the church to shame, right? Because he's just doing everything right. Like, he's just doing everything right down the line. And this is the beginning. I mean, you need these leaders. Like, nobody's going to change unless somebody actually becomes that change. So that's what he did. He was very courageous, and he was hardcore. He was a hardcore radical. He was very disciplined, and he wanted to follow the ways of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And he began to attract a lot of attention. And when people would be sort of skeptical and brought a lot of fear and complaints, he would bring peace and peace and consolation. So St. Francis, out of respect for the church authority, it wasn't mandatory, but he wanted to get a blessing from the Pope at the time, which was Pope Innocent III. So he decides he wants to go to Rome, take him and his brothers, go to Rome, and to get a blessing so that he can begin to preach to the people, in the area, and or anywhere for that matter. He was never a priest. He never wanted to become a priest. And, that was always his intention. He just wanted to remain who he was, which is basically a dedicated layman. And, he wanted to plead his case to the Pope. So, he's going from one world to another, right? He's going from this poverty-stricken, area, and he's going all the way to all this royalty, right? Like the Pope's, church or cathedral, what have you. It's full of gold and marble, and he's going in, entering with him and the brotherhood. They travel, and they're going in like barefoot, right? So he's risking losing everything, right? Because if the Pope doesn't allow him to preach, then the Pope might also send out an edict or something condemning him or whatnot. So it was kind of risky. He wanted to get a blessing, but at the same time, he didn't want to get a condemnation, so to speak.
Yeah, the Pope could also have you rubbed out too, if they considered you to be a big enough threat.
I'm sorry, rubbed out? What is
executed?
Really? I did not know that.
Well, for the price, I mean, yeah, the penalty for heresy, at least in the High Middle Ages, was burning at the stake. And
I did not know that.
The penalty for suspected heresy was like a life sentence, like house arrest for the rest of your life. So, like Joan of Arc, they convicted her of heresy, and and that's why she was burned. That's like the most famous example that I know of is Joan of Arc. And then Galileo he got convicted of suspected heresy, and they just put him under house arrest. I'm not sure when that practice started, like when the practice of burning at the stake started, because for sure it wasn't something that was an early church custom. I don't know when it started. It might not have been. Maybe it wasn't started when Francis of Assisi was there. I'm not sure when it started. I should know that, but yeah, for the High Middle Ages, that was definitely a problem if you offended the Pope or got accused of heresy.
You see this all the time, like the leadership always being challenged and put to shame by these saints. It's happened time and time again in history, and that's how it's always been. So, Pope Innocent III, he was actually called. Many people had called him at the time Lord of the World. So he was probably the most powerful pope who had ever lived, or it's accepted the Catholic Church traditionally. And here's this crazy man coming in barefoot, with a few followers, and he's just making his presence, and he's talking about radical living of the gospel. Poverty is obviously an affront. It considers a threat to the lifestyle of the papacy, of the cardinals. And there's some suspicious about Francis, and, cardinals, would say to the Pope, just dismiss this man. He's just a poor beggar. He doesn't even know how to put on his shoes when, comes in your presence. And, but Innocent was, however, not just a man of power. He was also a visionary, and he
Innocent or
saw.
innocent?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it. There you go.
Sorry, I couldn't
He
help
was
it.
innocent. He was innocent, and innocence is true power. So he clearly saw. He definitely lived up to his name, and he clearly saw that Francis was truly a man of God, and that to reject him would be to reject the gospel. So, he basically gave this barefoot prophet uh, papal permission to go and preach, and the Pope saw basically a genuine Christ image in Francis, and Francis saw a genuine Christ image in Innocence, and we can imagine, innocent telling Francis, have you found a new order? Where are you going to live? And St. Francis is like, well, we don't really have a monastery. We've just been sort of sleeping in the banks of streams and whatever, and and we're just going out to preach the gospel, but it, we don't know how that conversation exactly went, but he could have asked him, where'd you get your theological training from? Holy Father, he would maybe say, I just happen to feel the Spirit of God. So, it must have been a really wonderful, amazing encounter. We don't know exactly what happened, but definitely it was a very spiritual experience. And he told them yes, he approved. So, we don't, well, you probably don't know this, but traditionally, prophets, didn't really get along well with the institutional leaders, right? Because the leaders were always worried about heresy and people going out and preach and saying this, and that. So it wasn't easy to get approval by any stretch of the imagination. And this is where at least, they come together, Francis and his friars. They go back and from Rome, and they're heading back to Assisi, and they're thinking, okay, they get back, and you think that everything is going to be back to business as usual. Well, everything is not back to business as usual. Okay, in Rome or in Assisi, and they get back, and they stop for a while, and Francis basically says, okay, well, now what do we do? Do we go and live as hermits and away from the world and go out and preach, and what capacity are we going to involve ourselves with the world? How often we preach and be in our community, so to speak. So, a lot of people, when they would see them coming to preach in society, they would, they could easily think that they're disreputable, that they're just unwelcome beggars, and they were actually made fun of, and they weren't accepted, welcomed in the beginning, and they would have like mud thrown at them, and there was just a great deal of skepticism about who this guy was. So, anyway, spring of 1209, early 13th century. Something happened that, would make Francis be considered the patron saint of animals. So the story goes, he began to preach the gospel to a bunch of people, and, talking about their lives, and the people began to get bored, and they ignored him. And so, Francis got very angry and said, well, I might as well be talking to the birds. And he starts proclaiming to the birds, and the birds actually became very quiet when he began to preach. So this could be understood at a symbolic level, for Saint Francis' his missionary work, or his mission. And basically, you'll find this in a lot of his paintings, that he's preaching to these different kinds of birds. So usually what you'll see is crows, daws, and I think like pigeons or peacocks or something like that. And they represent traditionally the lower classes of society, right? The poor people, the laborers. Okay, so these are not the nicest looking birds. They're very dark colored looking birds. They're, I mean, not necessarily the dark or whatnot, but they're noisy birds, and they're not very nice either. But they all became quiet when he began to preach. So you know, he 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 uh, he starts preaching to them, and there's another story that I read that he tried to get he tried to get an edict or make it law so that people would be able to take care of like different animals and birds, so that um, I don't know what is something about being part of God's creation and this and that they should be required to take care of the animals and not leave them just neglected and whatnot. And so these paintings were communicated to a medieval audience. Not that he was really dealing with the animals, but that he was ministering, like I said, to lowest members of society. So you also see him, sort of in front of a bird bath with little birds, and he's preaching the gospel to them. So you'll see different depictions, whether in stained glass or in paintings and things like that. So his whole life, he's a lot of people could have seen him as a romantic lover of nature, but that's not necessarily true. So that was kind of propaganda that happened later, but he wasn't this warm fuzzy person all the time, right? He actually went through a lot of suffering, and he called people to lead very hard, difficult lives. He was describing a perfect formula for society, and um, you know, and he's teaching people to love one another, love your enemies. You know, that you have to improve the world in little ways, and we have to love our neighbors as ourselves. And if you don't want to, you know, uh, provide your neighbors with things and love them in an active way, at least do them no harm and show tenderness. And basically this was an inexhaustible effort on St. Francis's part toward every step that he took. He was proclaiming peace. And when people were always showing warnings and skepticism, he would always proclaim benevolence and caring and God's love for all. When people were proclaiming duty and sacrifice, he was uh, proclaiming a new kind of approach to Christianity. And this attracted lay people of the cities and of Italy. And basically, he did that without being angry or mad at anybody. And he was basically challenging the traditional structures of authority without even realizing. And he was starting a new social movement. And this message appealed to both men and women. And so he was, the movement was enriching. It was complicated. Not complicated, sorry. It was enriching, and it was beginning to attract a noblewoman of Assisi. And she was, her name was Claire Alfreducci, and she was actually the daughter of a wealthy knight. And I think when she had when she was young, she listened to one of St. Francis's sermons, and she was basically her breath was taken, by one of his sermons. And so she had a great reputation for being holy, and she was always in sync with Francis's his own heart and his own teachings. And so that she had heard that he began to preach in the church, and she wanted to join Francis in his movement, and she wanted to leave her family and go and become part of his order, so to speak, that he was beginning. So he didn't realize he was forming the Franciscan order. He was just doing what he saw, what God was showing him. But little did he know that this would become a way for hundreds of thousands of followers after that. So one Palm Sunday, Claire ends up leaving her parents' home. She goes to Francis and she begs him to let her join, his movement. And she gives up her beautiful clothing, and Francis gives her the Franciscan simple beggar's garb. So she's asking the Lord to enlighten her heart, to give her a life of repentance, and to begin following the teachings of Saint Francis, because she really did see him as a beloved father and a great example. So he ends up cutting off a little bit of her hair as a symbol that she's sort of left the world and that she's now the spiritual daughter. And she's now, and she's serving Christ. So he didn't allow her to live among the friars, but he arranged for her to live at a little church of San Damiano, where Saint Francis first heard the voice of God when he went, the first time when he went to go repair, when he just happened to duck inside. So this ended up beginning the convent of the Poor Ladies, and so started by Claire, her sister, and her widowed mother, and basically they pursued a life of radical poverty. And so from behind of the cloister wall, and they would embrace poverty and they would give to the poor. So this was a vision that both men and women were taking part in. So this is very powerful, right? This is not anymore about monks or nuns, or this is really about the church as a whole. So really everybody sort of had to become overshadowed under this man's wings, because he was really seeing the vision of God, and it was really beginning to change the world. So this began after he served and started accomplishing all these things. It took a toll on St. Francis. He continued to give up more of his time. He gave up time with his friends, and he feared for his survival because he lived a very hard life and he pushed his body very hard. And so disease began to take toll on his frail body. So once again, he gets sick. He gets bouts of malaria, like a fever. And he's only 31 years old, and this is in the winter. And his body's so weak, and he was too weak to continue preaching. So a brother called Gillis, one of his companions, said, if he had been robust like me, surely the world could never have kept pace with his flaming spirit. So you can just imagine a 31-year-old basically having a body of just an old man. Like that's really how much he had accomplished in the first 31 years of his life. He was so wearied and tired, and he felt so old before his time. And he wanted to leave to his friars, the rounds of preaching and ministry. And he wanted to just, go off and pray and be alone. So the next 4 years, he was confined to a straw bed. And within that period of 4 years, there were 3,000 new friars joined the brotherhood. So you see this constant theme of suffering and victory with the saints. I find it ironic how in the time when he was most vulnerable and most weak was when he was gaining most of his followers, 3,000 new friars during that time. It wasn't during the time when he was preaching and giving to the poor. It was during a time when he was completely worn out and lived a life of seclusion. So it just goes to show you the life of the saints, the spiritual economy, the wealth that they had in Christ, right? And the leadership that they showed in the church. So, he began to grow weaker and weaker, and I believe he sent a letter to Claire that that he probably would not continue to be a hermit. And um, I'm not exactly sure the details of the letter, but I think he was communicating to her, that he wanted to continue preaching, but he was too tired, and that he felt like it's something that, or he was too tired. Sorry, it's the other way around. He was too tired to preach, but he was still ready to move on, and he wanted to begin preaching actually in in the Middle Eastern country, like in Egypt, actually. So so imagine after all this, he now wants to go preach overseas. So now he's following the example of Christ. Now he's like following the example of St. Paul, right? Because St. Paul is traveling overseas as well. So he decides he wants to set sail for Egypt. And so, during this time, um, there was still a lot of wars going on and a lot of violence during that time. And Jerusalem was being captured by Muslim forces. And, all of Christendom at this time was in moral outrage. And um, basically, the Christendom was being sort of defiled and polluted by the presence of the Muslims, so to speak, and it needed to be rectified.
Well,
So,
during this time, they were pushing. They'd already taken over North Africa and most of Spain, and they were pushing the Byzantines in the east. So the Syria and Egypt are already under them.
we have
Yeah,
the Crusaders too, who are also trying to fight them off, and if I'm not mistaken, and does that make sense, or am I totally wrong about that? Like the Crusaders had nothing to do with the Islamic invasion.
the First Crusade started in 1096. So First Crusade is 1096. Saint Francis was born in 1181. So yeah, the Crusades were still going on at this time, right? Yeah.
So he had been in May of 1219. Francis goes on this journey to preach and convert to the Muslims, in Egypt. So, you know, he this was a very risky, dangerous journey, just like St. Paul. And so, you know, uh, they were all, the Crusaders were committing crimes at the time, and or no, not crimes. Sorry, the Crusaders were also warmongers, and but for him to go to a country that was being invaded by the Muslims, to preach the gospel could have easily been punishable by death in Muslim lands, right? So, it was considered a crime. So he went off to try to convert the 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 infidel and so or the Muslim, sorry, and he wouldn't mind trying to gain the palm of martyrdom, so to speak. So he was ready to die for the faith. He goes and he witnesses one of the worst battles and that he'd ever seen. It was very shocking, and the great knights of Christian, were, like I said, they were no better than drunken, murderous, warmongers and thieves, and they were doing a lot of bad things.
Yeah, the
So,
thing about the Crusaders is like if you look at the medieval European art, they do have a lot of biblical illustrations. You can also see biblical illustrations inside of the Catholic churches, They
yeah,
had a lot of depictions, and in the medieval Book of Hours that
uh-huh,
that were there. And the thing about medieval European art, or at least Western European art,
uh-huh,
is all of it was anachronistic and all of it is inaccurate. So, like, let's say you're doing something in France or whatever. It doesn't matter. France, Spain, England, it's all Germany, all the same. They'd say, hey, illustrate the scene of Jesus being taken to the cross. They'd show maybe like Mary and disciples and other stuff wearing the exact same clothes that were worn in that region of Europe during that time, the architecture would be European, and the Roman soldiers would be wearing like 13th century Western European armor, because they didn't know anything about history. I mean, the Catholic Church had a lot of good archives, but the average, it wasn't available to the average person. And so the average person figured that like all of the Christians and biblical saints and everything is somebody that looks like me, a Western European. So when they got there, like into Syria and other places, they couldn't tell the difference between Christians and Muslims and Jews initially in the Middle East. And I think it's because of the religious art. They just assumed that any Christians and Jews would look like they appear in the church illustration. In other words, look like Western Europeans. So they would massacre towns and stuff. But what I think that once they took over a place, it wasn't so bad. It was just when they took over, they would be kind of rough. And to be fair, the whole reason the Crusades started is because of the attacks on the Byzantine Empire. The emperor wrote a letter to the Pope asking for help because these people were not stopping, and they couldn't be reasoned or bargained with. So he had to call for help. But the people that were sent were not the smartest people. They're not the smartest, not the most educated. And they had some serious blunders like attacking Constantinople, and I actually think if you were, they did know that like Egypt was mostly Christian, they knew that, and they considered going and liberating it. I don't remember what the reason was that they ultimately decided against it, but if they had been smarter, kind of more strategic thinking about it, then that would have been like where you would have started. Because if you could have taken Egypt, then you could have taken the Holy Land next, because you would have been cutting off it would have been a huge blow to the food supply. Like when the Muslims took Egypt away from the Byzantine Empire, it really hurt them because so much of their food was grown there. It was a major food growing region. It's also a good source of personnel because it's a densely populated area. So it was a big loss. I mean, the Crusaders, we should probably do some topics on the Crusaders, but in my view, they were not very smart from everything that I've seen.
Yeah,
Although I don't blame them for going to the Middle East because, I mean, Muslims were attacking Europe, not just the Byzantine Empire, but also in
innocent
Spain.
bystanders. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was really like, and we both went through the public education system where they try to paint it like the Crusaders went and started the fight, but that's not true. They were answering a distress call.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, you can't you attack someone.
They were answering a distress call, but at the time, like I said, it's radical on both sides. Even what St. Francis is doing is radical. Like you're having these radical battles, and now he's doing something radical by getting in the middle of it. And this is early 13th century, and there's just a lot of, I mean, there's just a lot of danger going on. So he's going behind enemy lines. He's trying to make peace with the Sultan of Egypt himself.
Did he make it? I'm sorry. Yeah, did he make it there? My bad. We got.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, he ends up getting escorted to the camp of the Sultan, and he expects that he's going to be a terrible savage, sort of, what's the word? Committed to the destruction of the Christendom and the good Christian people, but he actually finds a very highly educated, cultured, courteous, devout, religious man, and he basically had a good reputation for being a cosmopolitan, and he enjoyed mystical poetry, and and so I think they had a conversation. I think like I don't know if the story goes they were playing chess or something like that, or not. I don't think they were playing chess. I think, but that's just sort of the game that they would play at the time, the board game, and so I don't know what, I can't recall what they said about the chess or whatnot from the source I was going by, but but chess was a game created during that time, during the time of war, so there was no chess involved. Actually, it wasn't really a chess match with the Sultan at all. He was actually very open to Francis preaching to him the gospel, and he respected him, and he wanted peace as much as Saint Francis did. So Saint Francis was quite shocked, and he thought that he gained a new respect, for the Sultan, and he became very, very, very vulnerable toward him, and he had realized that there are people who are living as Christians, but they're not Christians, by name, and then you have crusaders who are not really acting in a Christian manner. So he received more and more insight, about he's beginning to grow in his compassion for all people, not just Christians, right? So, anyway, he makes it back home, and he starts to deal with a lot of maybe a heat stroke. I think he was dealing with starvation, and disease, and he acquired another disease. He got flies in his eyes,
Oh,
became infected with trachoma, and it's a parasitic disease, and basically would rob him of his sight.
hmm.
His eyesight weakened, but his vision, like I said, for goodness and mercy was growing, right? So he was seeing more things from a spiritual perspective, right? But he was beginning to diminish. His health was beginning to diminish. So he, I think he received news that the Crusaders had a defeat in Egypt, and he came home, and he seemed like a miracle, and the pious tradition basically holds that if you make a commitment of faith, life is very easy. But it wasn't like that. Nothing was easy for Saint Francis. You always get this sort of aura about the monastic communities, and everything is supposed to be in the way of moderation, and that's what Saint Anthony taught. He said many were saved, with moderation and little labors, something like that. And but even Saint Anthony went through the greatest trials.
Yeah.
He was always preaching moderation, but went through the greatest trials. And so this idea that if you're pious, then you should lead a very quiet, peaceful life. But it was not, like I said, it was not easy for him. This man was constantly putting himself in harm's way, for the faith. So, he began to see, you know, um, I think it was a lot more difficult, I think, for people to start following him, because he was following a more radical way of Christianity than what most of his followers were willing to reach. Um, and I think there's I think at that point, um, the friars wanted wanted to go back to like a traditional monastic life, and they wanted to begin acquiring buildings and owning books, and and so Francis was struggling sort of to hold on to his original vision of absolute poverty, living in obedience and chastity, and not having anything of our own. He's seen as like trying to chasten the brothers, and when they try to convince them that oh well, we're moving towards a more moderate route, and to do this, and we want to serve in this way, and we look after the community. He's saying no. No means no. This is what don't you understand? This is our original vision, and we're going all the way through. And because he's always had his eyes on Christ, and Christ, he was obedient till death, and he lived a very selfless life, and so Saint Francis was following that example, and he felt that the new monastic community that they were trying to create was diluting his message, and he basically could not recognize anymore his original fraternity. So the new friars ended up prevailing. Saint Francis was sort of pushed, to the margins of his own order. You know, uh, I'm sure that he had felt betrayed, and um, he felt like this darkness. He began to feel this darkness. In his soul, and he's suffering tremendously. Almost like Christ at Gethsemane. Before he was going to be taken up and to take on the sins for the world. Like he went through a really physically, emotionally, psychological battle. Like, have I been doing everything right? I mean, have I, because he's still a human too. He still had his own weaknesses. So he's basically at this point, he just feels like, nobody is continuing to follow his message, and he's beginning to feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. That he's not. This is not for him, or this is maybe he had it all wrong, and and how he has all these regrets, and um, so to speak, and of course the enemy had a role in that, in trying to put more pressure on him and make him feel like he was the one going crazy, so to speak. And so, you know, he's dealing with this conflict, and he basically, at the end of this suffering, he basically feels like a corpse, and that basically he is dead to them, to those friars, to that new movement, and he is resigned, and that's it. He was entering his final stages of his conversion. Um, and according to the earthly standard, he was considered a failure. So this wasn't like this superhero type of ending. It was a very Christ-like ending, and he really was alone. He really was alone, like Christ was alone on that cross. And the saint, and there was he only had but maybe a few friends at the time, when he was going nearly blind, and beginning to suffer, and his health beginning to diminish. And so the story goes that even after all this, I mean, the grace of God just amazing. He goes and climbs up to Mount Laverna, and he spends 40 days and 40 nights in fasting and prayer. And basically, he goes up there, and he goes up there to pray. And actually, my mother, when I was younger, I saw a picture of a friar monk, and he had a small little prayer. And I'll go over that prayer that he has, but it turned out being Saint Francis, called the Prayer of Saint Francis. He has arms up and he's praying, and that's that very scene. He's up on Mount Laverna, and we don't know exactly what happened up there, but as he was praying, it's just a long retreat. And like I said, he felt like he was full of doubts, and he felt like he was being misguided, and that he was, a victim, and and that he felt that he had let God down. And so he goes up there to pray, and and so at this point, it's definitely something very mystical. And at the end of his prayer, uh, basically he feels like God has basically given him some resolution, basically has accepted everything that he's done for them, and that he was on the right path from the very get-go. And at that moment, the most incredible thing happens in his life, and this is where you get another famous depiction. Basically, he gets a vision of a crucified seraphim. He appears to him, and he's basically given the 5 wounds of Christ on the cross. And 5 wounds, being the hands, the feet, and then the wound on the side. And he receives what we call the stigmata. So I don't think he ever said anything about his wounds to anybody, but that was the first time that any stigmata had been recorded, like, period, amongst any saints or all the saints. And this beautiful seraph, this 6-winged seraph, on like a fiery cross, like, appears to him. and gives him these 5 wounds. And that's basically was a symbol of everything that he had done for Christ, and that he truly did go all the way to the cross for him. And so, it's a very powerful moment, and that's another famous depiction you'll find in a lot of his paintings. That's actually like one of the main depictions that you see. So, yeah, it was very intense. Like I said, Saint Veronica went through that stigmata. Saint Rita went through a similar situation where she, like, a nail on her forehead, she received, or a thorn on her forehead. And he's facing the last few years of his life. So you think it'd be over by now. I mean, the guy's gone through sickness, fatigue. I mean, he almost died in the middle of a war, and he goes on the mountain, and he's, on the bed for 4 years. And then after all that, he bears the scars of leprosy. He begins to get leprosy upon his body. So they were basically wounds of suffering and illness that was contracted in the service of Christ. And that's what his whole mission was. So they actually they also call him the walking crucifix. So that's a very huge title to get. You can only imagine how wonderful this saint is. So
I got a question. So you said the last 4 years of his life he was bedridden.
Well, he was bedridden for the 4 years when he began to grow, like that social movement, to repair the corruption of the church.
Okay. All right. So he was bedridden for a while, and then he recovered enough to go to Egypt, right?
Go to Egypt, yeah. He goes overseas, and then when he comes back, go ahead.
Yeah, no. I just wanted to understand the order. Yes. So then now he's getting leprosy and he's going blind.
Yeah. I mean, he was going blind, losing his eyesight, and then he receives the stigmata. But then and then after that, I guess he begins to acquire leprosy, I think. So basically, he can't even walk on his own weight anymore. He gets carried to Saint Damiano. He can no longer. I think he can. I'm not sure if he lost his vision. As he got older completely, but you know, he's facing death. Like that's it. He's getting old. He's about to pass away, and he still feels this great darkness come on him. He still has this anxiety about death, and in a night of agony, he summons the strength to dictate a poem in praise of God's creation, and he is singing his swan song that he knew every troubadour sang at the end of his life. I'll have to look that up, but basically the poem goes, all praise be to you, O Lord, and through all that you've made, and that basically the thank you, Lord, for bringing the day and the light, and giving us the fire, the brother. He called the fire his brother and death his sister, because the fire was there for him at night to guide him, in his suffering for Christ and be able to endure the suffering. And then death was his sister, which reminded him, to always be careful. And he called like the moon and the stars his sister in the heavens, and he had a lot of sisters and brothers in a poem. And so he's basically glorifying God, and that's that. I think when he passes away, I think they say that they saw larks. They saw a bunch of larks basically ascending into the heavens, like when he passed away, and so, I mean, he was enriched by his poverty. He was poor, but he became rich through that poverty, and I think he died at the age of 44. And yeah, he was finally able to look death in the eye. He was no longer scared of it. He called it his sister, and he had a few friends with him to give him a last farewell. And you know, he was lonely, but he wasn't frightened. He had a few people with him, and before he passed away, too, he would rise and start whispering the Psalms too, and you know, and Saint Clair was there, I believe, at the time, or at least she knew that his end was near. But he was no longer scared of death, and yeah, he served God, and he died exactly at the time of dusk.
Hmm.
Right at dusk, he passed away, and very quietly, and they saw a bunch of larks just ascending. You know, the moment that he passes, and 2 years after he passed, the church made him a saint. You know, in the Church of Rome, a grand basilica was built to hold his remains. So now today, you know, tens of thousands of Franciscans and millions of men and women around the world continue his ministry. And he's most widely known for his prayer. Like I said, that's what was on that little picture that my mother put sort of on a coffee table, like in the hallway in the main entrance of our house. And it was written in honor of him during World War One. And basically it says like, "Oh Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me sow love. You know, where there's injury, pardon. Whether there is doubt, faith. Where there is doubt, faith. Um, you know, where there's despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy." And he asks, and he continues and says, "Grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive it. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life." So, with that being said, you know, we have to commend this great saint for what he did, because many people are now being saved, and they're pretty much walking in his footsteps. Many saints, thousands of monks know this great saint and are following his great example. So, thank you, Ivor Kovac, for giving me the opportunity to share his story. He's definitely a great inspiration.
Yeah, seems and of course, you know, I've heard of Saint Francis before, and a lot of people do quote from him, but you know, I didn't really know that much about him. So I appreciate you for bringing this topic. It looks, I think, and actually, you know, looking at the pictures, there's a lot of depictions of him in different styles, and you know, from different periods of time they were made. Like I can see there's some medieval depictions as well as like some romantic period and then some more recent depictions as well. It looks like
Yeah.
he did. I saw something that said he was the patron saint of ecology, and it looks like he did talk to other animals as well, like dogs and wolves. And I see the birds, the images of birds, but also dogs and wolves.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and
Yeah.
uh, I it does say somewhere in the Bible. I don't remember where, but like it says that God even cares about the birds. So you know, I could see like some people, you know, maybe trying to preach to them as well. Um,
Yeah.
so it's kind of interesting. It seems like he had compassion for everybody, like even the animals too. Kind of cool. Um, Kind of a horrible, lingering way to die, though. All those diseases and everything. Man. Um, yeah. So
Yeah,
I do
Jonathan.
have
I
a
mean,
question. Some of the images I see him with a skull, holding a skull, or with a skull
I,
nearby. Do you know what that's about?
I think he called. I think he called like death his sister or something, because
Ah,
it always like it always like gave him life. It was through the cross that he did have the peace and he did have eternal life. Like the ability to look at death and to face death and to not be worried or troubled by it is what gave him the most peace. So I think when there's no other way of putting it. I mean, this is obviously a very mighty saint of the Lord. This is somebody who just defeated the odds. And I think the main thing, his intention was to truly just spread the love of God. He wanted people. He wasn't out there for people to suffer. Like he didn't want people to suffer. He suffered for their sake. He wanted people to actually be well. He wanted to heal. He wanted to heal people and give people peace. So that was his main mission. And yeah, I think I'm trying to see what other facts I can find. I think he wished to persuade the emperor to make a special law that men should then provide well for the birds and the beasts as well for the poor, so that all might have occasion to rejoice in the Lord. Maybe this is something a little bit beyond, something a little bit kind of goes over our heads a little bit.
Well, I mean, there are people that are concerned about animals also.
Yeah, of course. Of
So,
course. We of course. We love our animals. We love our pets. I think but to ask the emperor to to make it a law to take care of the birds and the beasts, like that's kind of
that's probably that's probably why they designated him as the saint of ecology.
oh,
Yeah, I mean, I think probably he wasn't thinking about like the planet, like all these nutters today, but it's more like just also feeling compassion for the animals too, So, I mean, that I can understand to some degree, but yeah, I'm thinking it sounds like he was also concerned about the animals as well. Maybe not all animals, probably, but yeah, it's kind of interesting, and I'm sure there's a lot more information about this guy that we don't know. Sounds like he did a lot of things, even though he didn't live very long.
yeah. I mean, by the time he was 31, I mean, he said also something as far as something to the effect of courtesy indeed in the saints. He's courtesy indeed was the younger sister of charity and one of the qualities of God himself. Who of his courtesy he declares gives a son and his reign to the just and the unjust. This habit of courtesy Francis ever sought to enjoin on his disciples. Whoever may come to us, he writes, whether a friend or a foe, a thief or a robber, let him be kindly received. And the feast which he spread for the starving brigands in the forest at Monte Casale sufficed to show. He said, if you're not be doers of the word, don't just be hearers of the word. He was geared more towards the practical, or he set aside more of the theoretical questions than the practical, and so he returned the gospel. He wanted people to lead a more practical way of life, a more practical, form of the gospel. So he died in 1226, and he was 40. I believe it was 45 or 44. Yeah, 44.
Just a little bit older than me. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's just the main. That's the main thing. I mean, what? It's just amazing. It's just, I think it's an amazing story. And for his time, like I said, he was sort of the pioneer of now what we know as the Franciscan order, which is probably the most popular monastic order. I mean, you have the Franciscan, then you probably Dominican would probably be the second most popular, then the Benedict, and then maybe the Augustinian. There's more orders, but those are the four ones that we've at least heard of at least one of them, right? So yeah, it's amazing. It's a beautiful story, and like I said, after his example. I don't know that I've never heard anybody say I have St. Francis of Assisi as an intercessor, so to speak, but definitely a saint that leads by example. He wasn't much about what he said. It was really about what he did. And, you know, there's nothing to say when you go to a community of lepers and when you go to serve the poor and, you know, you unite this convent, this order of nuns and these order of monks where they're living a life of poverty and they're helping the poor and then, you know, you bring them all together and you get afflicted. Instead of getting rewarded and honored, you get pain and suffering, and the movement grows. But then he goes back to, he wants to set sail and go to Egypt and, you know, try to spread the word to the Muslims, and then he comes back and becomes ill again, and so he just went through a lot in 44 years of his life to do all that. It's incredible.
Yeah, that's a tough life, and you know, I mean, I guess he would be rewarded in heaven for all that, but like, yeah, as far as this world goes, he definitely didn't get any reward for it.
You know,
Quite the opposite.
and he went to the Pope.
Suffering.
It was a great saint. I mean, from the very get go, when you just make yourself naked, you know, basically strip yourself naked in front of all these people. I mean, it's just, you know, these are the lives of the saints. It's just very radical things, and it's amazing, you know, the grace of God. And I think it's most important for our audience to know that the core of his life was love and joy. He was loving and joyful from the very beginning. And it wasn't until his father began to stop that love that he had in his heart for other people that he decided to make a stand and say, you know what, I'm just going to keep on going and I'm going to continue spreading my love to the world. So, yeah, that's the most important thing I think our audience has to understand. So, yeah. So thanks for that, Ivor Kovac. You know, we'll have to do maybe a video on the Crusades, maybe Hildegard.
Yeah,
you know, others. You know,
I'm working on Hildegard von Bingen. I'm reading her book called Scivias. There's other videos and other people have talked about her on YouTube. That's a very interesting individual, especially, you know, given the times that we're living in now. But yeah, we'll definitely. So if anyone is interested in Hildegard von Bingen, like, that's something that I'm working on. I'm gonna be very thorough when it comes to that. Okay. So yeah, but yeah, good topic, great Pharaoh.
Oh, thank you, Ivor Kovac. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, and if anybody, you know, leave us a comment, or, you know, if you like this content, or even if you dislike it, also leave us a comment. And other than that, yeah, see you guys in the next one, I guess.
All right, see you guys. Thank you.
Deus homo factus est natura mirante, unus renovatus est a Christo regnante. Gaudete, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.